All right, well, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for joining us on what turned out to be a lovely spring afternoon. This was supposed to be our Friends garden party to thank the Friends for all the support they give us throughout the year. And inevitably, if we have the Friends garden party scheduled, you're sure it will be a rainy day or at least very wet on the ground. But I just want to take a moment, though, to thank the Friends for all the support that they give the Society. The Society relies on philanthropy for all that it does. We are not government funded. We are not a state organization. So 100% of what we do comes from philanthropy, and the Friends program is integral to everything that we do. Friends funds help support early career scholars conducting research in all different fields. The Society's motto on the seal here is Nullo Discrimine. We support research in all fields because we believe all knowledge can be useful, and we provide over 300 grants and fellowships every year to primarily early career scholars doing cutting-edge research on all 7 continents, and the Friends program helps underwrite those grants. We have a number of public programs. We have an incredible library of 14 million pages of manuscripts. And we have this great museum over on 5th and Chestnut that gets up to 200,000 visitors before COVID, and I think we're on track to hit that number again. So we do an incredible amount of work here, but it really relies on your support for making that happen. And this public lecture series that every year gets around 3,000 visitors, whether in person or online, is entirely underwritten by the Friends program. So I want to thank you all, and I think you all owe yourselves a round of applause for your support. Thank you. I also want to mention a couple of upcoming events, also underwritten, of course, by the Friends program. On June the 5th, we're doing a book launch party for our librarian, Michelle McDonald, and her new book, Coffee Nation, which is a study of the centrality of coffee to early America and its role in part of the early republic. So I hope you'll all come here. That's June the 5th here in Franklin Hall. And on July the 1st, we're launching our digital portal called Philadelphia, the Revolutionary City. The APS, along with a number of other partners like the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the University of Pennsylvania, the Museum of the American Revolution. For years, we've been digitizing a large swath of our materials that relate to the American Revolution in Philadelphia. We now have over 50,000 pages digitized in an online repository that creates a one-stop shop for anybody trying to study the American Revolution in Philadelphia. And on July the 1st, we're releasing that to the world. It's going to be an incredible resource. We've targeted 2026 for the launch, but I also want to say this is a legacy project. This digital repository is going to last in posterity and going to be a resource for teachers, for students, and scholars for decades to come. So I hope you'll join us on July the 1st to celebrate that accomplishment. But we're here today to celebrate another accomplishment, and that's the book launch for Mary Beth Norton. Many of you are probably familiar with Mary Beth Norton and her work. I will tell you a brief story. Mary Beth and I were getting lunch over at Frida's, and she and I were in a conversation. This was a year ago or so. I don't know if you remember. And we were just having a conversation, and she was going to give a talk at the Museum of the American Revolution. And all of a sudden, there's these 2 women eating next to us. They get up after they're done and said, "Are you Mary Beth Norton?" And she said, "Yes, I am." And they said, "We're teachers, and we've been using your stuff in our classroom." So Mary Beth had an incredible contribution, both as a scholar, but she's reached well beyond the campus and into the classroom. She is the Mary Donlin Alger Professor of American History Emerita at Cornell University, where she taught for over 40 years, 47 years. That is over 40, but no. And this is really important. She was the first woman faculty member in Cornell's history department. What an accomplishment. She's a leading historian of early American history and women's history. She's written a number of award-winning books that you're probably familiar with, such as Liberty's Daughter, The Revolutionary Experience of American Women, 1750 to 1800, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. In the Devil's Snare, The Salem Witch Crisis of 1692. 1774, the long year of revolution. So if you were to ask Mary Beth Norton when the revolution started, it's not next year, it was actually last year, which was the winner of the 2021 George Washington Prize for the best book on the Revolutionary Era. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and she was elected to the American Philosophical Society in 2010. So she is an elected member of the Philosophical Society. And she's here today to launch her new book, which you can see here, I Humbly Beg Your Speedy Answer, Letters on Love and Marriage from the World's First Personal Advice Column. Mary Beth is going to say a few words, and then we're going to talk a little bit about a few of these letters, right? All right, great.
So, I want to start today with this image of a coffee house. And you may wonder why there is an image of a London coffee house in the 1690s with gentlemen having a rather spirited discussion when I'm talking about the world's first personal advice column. But the generation of the world's first personal advice column came from coffee houses. And it came from a guy named John Dunton, who was a printer who hung out in coffee houses. And he wrote in his autobiography that he thought up the idea for the Athenian Mercury, which is the publication I'll be talking about today, while walking in a park with a friend. Now, he doesn't say that he had just left a coffee house, but I'm convinced that he had. Because what happened in these coffee houses was that men sat around, and you can see they're smoking, they're reading, and they're talking. And they're actually, in this case, fighting, but they don't have to be. And it's all men. There's a woman in the back, and she is managing the coffee. There's a bunch of coffee pots on the fire there, but the woman is the manager. And so it's basically an all-male environment. And what did these men do? They sat around and they had long conversations, and in those conversations, just like we have conversations today, things came up that people didn't know the answer to. Questions were raised. Now, all of us today just pull our little computers out of our pockets and go to Google or Wikipedia or whatever to answer the questions. Well, there was no such thing, obviously, in 17th century London. So, in fact, what John Dunton invented was a search engine for the 17th century. And he did that by proposing what he called the Question Project, a journal or a periodical that would come out once a week. His initial idea was once a week. He had to switch it to twice a week because there were so many questions that poured in. But the idea was he put out a call and he said, "We are the Athenian Society. We will answer all your questions on any topics, history, science, religion, whatever. Just ask us and we are experts on everything and we will tell you the answers." So the questions poured in. I mean, literally poured in. And so he had to go to 2 issues a week. But the idea was you would ask your question anonymously, because anonymity was the key to all of this. People would ask their questions anonymously, and then they would get their answer in a week or 2 when the next issue came out, or the next issue that could deal with their question. And that's why these were cheap broadsheets. They sold for a penny each on the streets of London. And then every 20 issues or so, Dunton got into the habit of binding them into larger volumes that would then sit on the tables in the coffee houses with indexes. So people could look at the index and say, yes, there was a question about X 2 weeks ago, and now I can look that up because it's here. I can find it in the index. So that's John Dunton, and that's his idea. And here he is, looking very bewigged. This is the frontispiece from his autobiography, which he published in 1705. It's one of the first autobiographies written in English language. He's only in his late 30s at that point. But he looks a lot older, but that's the wig, I think. He looks very serious. And I need to tell you that his book did not sell very well, although the Athenian Mercury was a fabulous success. In addition to the fact that there were all those questions, it went viral in modern terms. It was written about, talked about. There was a play that was written as a parody. There was imitators. Imitators tried and failed to do similar things. But Dunton was the guy behind it. And even though he ended his life as a bankrupt, having been in and out of the poorhouse, he started this cultural phenomenon, and the Athenian Mercury itself turned into the world's first personal advice column. Now, how did that happen? It happened because the readers wanted it. And to me, that's what's really fascinating. Dunton and his collaborators, who were his two brothers-in-law, he had one brother-in-law who was a minister and one brother-in-law who was a mathematician. They did not intend this to be a personal advice column. But people started to write to them asking personal advice questions. And it happened really fast. The 13th issue, so in the 6th week of publication, a man wrote in with a series of questions that were not precisely personal, but along the lines of personal advice. He asked questions like, don't people today marry too young? Or, don't people today, aren't they more likely to marry for money than for love, and isn't that a bad idea? I mean, those are the kinds of questions that he asked. So they answered those questions in that issue, and then they noted in the very same issue that they had received a letter from, quote, a lady in the country. And this was shocking. For one thing, it was only aimed at men, and for another, it was only aimed at London. So how did this lady in the country get a hold of the Athenian Mercury? Who knows? Some guy to whom she was connected obviously gave it to her, or she was in London and she bought one on the street. We don't know. But she asked the following question: will you answer questions from ladies as well as from gentlemen? And clearly, they hadn't ever anticipated answering questions from women, but they said, well, yeah, we'll answer questions from women. And so they did. And so in the beginning, women asked questions, or women continued throughout. I should say that the questioners always continued to ask the kinds of questions that the Athenians had originally expected. That is, questions about history and religion and science and so forth. But what began to happen was more and more questions came in about personal issues. And some people wrote in and said to the Athenians, you are destroying your learned reputation by answering these questions, especially the ones that come from women. And they responded, no, we are dealing with issues of families, and families are the basis of society, and society is the basis of the state, and so it's all relevant. So they defended themselves, and they continued to answer these questions. Now, I didn't do this, but a scholar did it and took a random volume and counted all the topics of the questions in that random volume and who was asking the questions. And what she discovered was that about 30% of the total questions in that randomly selected volume were about personal issues. And of that 30%, about 40% came from self-identified men. Remember, this is all anonymous, so we have to believe what the people said, who they were. Sometimes they said they were writing on behalf of a friend, and the Athenians saw through that pretty quickly. But anyway, they all said they tried to say who they were. So the issue then became, or I should say, about 20% of the self-identified questions came from women. And you're going to hear some of these questions tonight. So let me just give you a little bit more information here. This is where the Athenian Mercury was published. The black dot represents the site of Dunton's print office in central London. Cheapside still exists. The Poultry is long gone, but it was the name of a very short street. And the name of his address was at the sign of the Raven in the Poultry. So it took the production manager at Princeton Press and myself and a lot of historical research to figure out exactly where that was, but we think we did, and I think I've cited it properly on this map. So it was basically an area where he was surrounded by coffee houses and print shops. And here's what the Athenian Mercury looked like. It's not very exciting typographically. It's questions and answers. This is one issue from the third volume from September of 1691. And this other page would look exactly the same. So it's not as though It's very exciting in terms of looking at. Now, they did, in the beginning, he concealed his identity. The original volumes, when he published them, had a fake publisher's name on it, and the questions were not to be sent to him at his print shop. They were to be sent to to a coffee house. Eventually, that sort of broke down, and people began to figure out that who was behind the Athenian Mercury, but it took a while. And one of the things I'm most amused by is how the Mercury, and these are the bound volumes, how they changed the title of the first, between the first and the second volume. You'll notice the first volume says they print the nice and curious questions proposed by the ingenious, and the second one says proposed by the ingenious of either sex. And so they admit from the beginning of their bound volumes that they are answering questions from women, and they're dealing with women. So it's a very successful publication. One of the things I especially like is this image, the emblem of the Athenian society, which is published in 1692 at the height of its cultural importance. Here is supposedly the Athenians there, the bewigged guys at the top, who are the experts who are answering the questions. I'm remembering it's Dunton and his two brothers-in-law. But they are this is the way they are represented as these very big-wigged experts on everything. And then below you have people beseeching them, and the images on the cover of the book come from that second row of beseechers, though somewhat better off people who are holding up in their hands their letters for the Athenians to respond to. And but the people I especially like are the one at the bottom, and I especially like, if you can see, the woman who's beating on a man with a stick, and he is saying, you can't read it, but he says, "Help, help, noble Athenians." And so these are the ordinary folk down here at the bottom. The other things I really like about this image are the carriages at the bottom. You can't really see them, but the one on the left is coming from Oxford, and the one on the right is coming from Cambridge, and the images at the top are of Athens and Rome. So these are the aspirations of the Athenian society to be a part of these learned people. Now, this was a very successful publication. It lasted until 1697. Dunton's wife died. It seems clear in retrospect that she was a wonderful manager of his properties, and when she died, his finances really fell apart. He stopped publishing the Athenian Mercury for a while, but then restarted it. But then it did not last very long, and he remarried. And he did something that the Athenians told people never to do. He remarried for money, and the wealthy, widowed mother of his second wife pretty quickly figured out that he married the daughter only for money, and so he was out. And this is one of the reasons why he spent the last part of his life pretty much trying to get money from anywhere he could think of. He kept publishing books. He later claimed he had published more than 500 books. People who've written about him as a publisher think he exaggerated, but he certainly did publish a lot of books. I have looked at a lot of them, I can tell you, so at the Huntington Library in particular. And so he, being a bankrupt in the early 18th century, he sold the copyright to the Athenian Mercury to a man named Andrew Bell, who then put out 3 volumes and later a 4th volume of, quote, letters from the old Athenian Mercuries called the Athenian Oracle. And the Athenian Oracle can be traced in newspaper ads in the colonies, I assume in England as well, but I've only done the colonial part of this research, throughout the 18th century. Indeed, Benjamin Franklin advertised copies of the Athenian Oracle in when he was selling a bunch of books that he'd gotten from London in 1747, 1748. And the Library Company of Philadelphia did have books from did have copies of the Athenian Oracle, which they deaccessioned in 1769. So whether people were no longer interested in it, I don't know. But I have a final quote here. The Long Life of the Athenian Oracle. I found this online from a New Hampshire newspaper in 1796. And this is an aphorism from the Athenian Mercury, which is reprinted in the Athenian Oracle, and which is actually in one of the questions and answers we're going to be talking about tonight. So, with that introduction, is Adriana over there? I can't see her. No? Yes? Okay. Where? Oh, here she comes. All right, all right. Oh, God. I love it. I didn't know the costumes were coming.
If I could get ready for work here.
Yeah. So the way we've set this up is that Adriana Link will read questions from women, and Patrick Spiro, our leader, will be John Dunton responding to the questions. So the first question is a confession of premarital sex by a woman. And this is not unusual. This is not an unusual letter. And I will say that one thing for you to pay attention to in the question is her use of the word friends, because in the 17th century, that meant family, maybe even parents. So, and you will hear that in other letters as well tonight. Okay, so over to Adriana.
An impoverished gentleman on whom nature has lavished her stock to render him an unresisted instrument of melting the breasts of the softer sex, has allured that gift from me, which is only due to a husband and would willingly marry me. But my fortune being inconsiderable, I fear I should render myself despicable and irretrievably poor. My friends have introduced a gentleman of an inviting estate, whose person I could like, had I not foreseen my handsome deceiver. I am racked with confusion what resolution I shall take herein, and since my poor judgment is weak and imperfect, as is common to my sex, I entreat you would speedily impart your friendly advice.
First, repent. Then, either remain unmarried or marry him that has been so well acquainted with you. For you cannot justly marry any other. We would not have printed this had we not thought that others might take warning by your example.
So just to make a little comment about this question and answer, money issues are fairly common in the letters that I reprint, but her reference to female weakness is unique. I never saw another phrase like that in another letter. And the answer from the Athenians is pretty typical. Their answer was usually a person who admitted to sex outside of marriage should marry their first sex partner or remain single. And what is interesting here, too, is that they say that they want others to profit by her example. And so that's another, sometimes they will add sentences like that. So they're obviously not just talking to the person who is writing them, but they want to speak to a general audience. Okay, second question from Adriana. Another confession of premarital sex, but with a somewhat different take.
A gentleman, by 1,000 oaths and protestations to a lady, declared that he would be unhappy and miserable if she did not permit his passion. He vowed if she granted it, he would be eternally true to none but her. She, out of gratitude and goodness, at last granted it. But this perfidious man was no sooner sure of his conquest than he slighted what he had adored and died for. Now the lady, by too great an act of generosity, has removed his misery to herself. Query, can he marry another? Or is there any way to reclaim him?
No. He cannot lawfully marry anyone but that lady. But that result will be no satisfaction to you. For we may, without injustice, affirm that he who can be so base enough to betray so much goodness will never attend to his duty or conscience, if he even has any. Therefore, you are now bravely to resolve and conquer yourself by reason. You'll undoubtedly find more happiness that way than in anything else.
So, despite the perfidy of this guy, she seems to want him back in her question. And the Athenians are adamant, no, she shouldn't take him back. And their answer to her is pretty typical. You'll see it in other letters. To try to conquer her emotion by reason, thinking things through, calm down, and so forth. This is a pretty standard answer that they make. I notice she also comments that he slights her. By that, we would say ghosting. That's the 17th century equivalent of somebody being ghosted. So basically, he gets her in bed, and then he ghosts her. So that's her problem. Okay. Now, the next question is from a woman who was solicited for premarital sex who said no, unlike the first two. And the question is, did it help her? Over to you.
I am a young woman who has been courted by several very good gentlemen, but I could never love any of them. Then it was my hard fortune to be courted by a master of a ship, and I loved him as dearly as my life. When he knew I loved him, he would have lain with me, but as dearly as I loved him, I kept myself honest. He saw that he could not make a whore of me, told me he loved me for my virtue, and did it only to try me. So I could not hate him. All this was against my friends' consent, so that they turned me out of their doors because I loved him. But then he promised to marry me, and I lent him money. The night before we were to be married, he went away, and I have not seen him since. Pray be pleased to advise me what to do. Had I best marry another, or live a maid all my lifetime? Oh, or send letters to him, kind words, or cross words for revenge. He has not sent one word since he went away, and my heart is almost broken. Your speedy answer is desired.
Well, this is a very complex case. But I have to admit, once a year we meet with such a request. One that whenever we do, we inform the world of it because there's much to be learned. This is what we have to say. By entertaining a faithless sailor against your friend's consent, you behaved badly and might have been more severely punished than you have been. It's good you came off as well as you did, and that your love and innocence together have not quite ruined you. We believe you escaped well with the loss of a little money only when you were left with your virtue, which is much more valuable. Now, to answer your questions, admit some other more virtuous and deserving lover, if you have any of such offers. This will be the best way to put the traitor out of your memory. As for letters to him, never trouble yourself, since either he'll not answer them at all, or else he'll wheedle you again, make 1,000 excuses, which men never lack, and 10 to 1, persuade you to believe him and give him all he had left behind. Or, if he should marry you, he might have 2 or 3 other wives in other ports, and they all will be served before you.
So this too, the Athenians don't like sailors. We have other letters where they regard sailors as being pretty faithless. But in addition, this statement that she's best to forget him, and the fact that they do give this statement against men these turn up in other answers also, not just in this one. And it's not just involving faithless sailors, it's also other men who they do not appreciate. So the next question is an old maid of 30 lists her options for marriage.
I am an old maid. 30 years of age. This is a state I always dreaded, and I cannot tell why fortune should be more unkind to me than she has been to the rest of my relations. I have only attracted a tailor, a weaver, and a journeyman shoemaker. I have a great aversion to all those trades. Even so, I would not have refused them all, except for my greater love for a barber, who used to honor me with his company a little now and then. But now he recognizes that I am in love with him, and he has stopped visiting me. He also avoids my company at all places where I go in hopes of seeing him. Now, gentlemen, my request is that you would please advise me what I should do about him. Otherwise, I must be forced to choose someone in one of the aforementioned trades, or at least the first that comes to me. Neither am I someone to avoid having two trades, viz. The art of japanning and periwig making. In addition, I have 30 or 40 pounds in ready money and a lottery ticket.
So this woman I especially like because of her lottery ticket, but also because she gives us unusual detail. For those of you who don't know what japanning is, it's like decorating a flat surface like a tray or something like that you would put a teapot on or whatever, so for decorative purposes. So she says she has two trades. She can japan and she can make wigs. So she gives us unusual detail. And now let's hear what the Athenians had to say.
Yes, thank you, my good lady, for letting me think more about this case. And I have to say, while it's long and convoluted, the answer is simple. Marry as fast as you can, and then grow wiser.
Okay, and we have another question from a woman. In this case, it's a woman who's denied the ability to marry the man she loves by her parents. And if you pay attention to the first line of her letter, it's not the first time she's asked the Athenians for advice. But it's a common situation, both the fact that people do say they've asked before and have not had an answer, but I find her answer more interesting than most and should be to other historians in the audience.
I presumed some time since to crave your advice in a case that almost distracts me. I am the most miserable creature in the whole world. My parents still continue so cruel, as to command me daily not to act on my love. Nay, they plainly tell me that if I do, they will never look upon me more. Yet I fear, if I cannot marry him, I must die for it. Dear gentlemen, pity me, and let me know your thoughts, what course is best to take.
The best method we know of is this. If your own entreaties won't prevail, make use of the interest of some of your friends. Here are some other things to do. Avoid solitariness. Read history. And nothing amorous. Use much company, but only that which is innocent. And never indulge yourself to think of your passion when alone. And what is yet the best remedy? Be frequent in your devotions and beg a quiet, peaceful mind. And this method cannot fail.
So again, this is a similar response to other people in the same situation who have been denied the ability to marry by their parents or the ability to marry the person they want by their parents. But this is the one that's most explicit about reading history and not amorous history to ease your mind.
Question from a gentleman.
I take those as well.
I have long lived in an unlawful, though successful, amour. I have enjoyed all the favors that a lovely young woman can bestow. I am very sensible of the sin I commit, as well as the injury I do the husband. I therefore beg your advice what measures I shall take to avoid the lovely tempter, who will not fail to press me to a continuance of our passion, which I am resolved to quit.
Thank you, my fine sir. In answer, we first hope the gentleman is in earnest and that he needs no more arguments to convince him of the absolute necessity there is of his leaving this damnable sin. He asks, what measures shall he take to avoid her? But we'll go further, as we suppose the writer desires, and direct him how to break it off entirely. This is what we'd advise. Do not do so personally, but by letter. In which, if he pleases, he may enclose this very paper, which perhaps may make the breach incurable. If it does, so much the better, for he'll have less the trouble afterward.
And indeed, this is a common answer too. They tell people who are trying to break off relationships to communicate by letter and possibly send a copy of the Athenian Mercury so the person can see the question and answer. And this occasionally is done by modern advice columnists also, I might add. I've seen people say, send this question and answer to them.
Is it permissible to marry a person one cannot love in compliance to relations and to get an estate?
Interesting. Marry for money. Well, we sometimes see persons loved tenderly after marriage who could hardly stand each other's sight before. But, as it's proposed here, whether we may marry such as we cannot love, the question must be answered in the negative, since such a practice would be the most cruel, imprudent thing to do in the world. Because society is the main end of marriage, love is the bond of society, and without love, neither pleasure, profit, or honor can be found in marriage. He then, or she, that marry for so base an end as profit without any possibility or prospect of love is guilty of the highest brutality imaginable. It is too general a truth to be feared that he who marries a woman he could never love will soon love a woman he can never marry.
So we'll end the questions and answers with that. And we're not done yet. Patrick and I are going to talk a little bit about what this all is about. But I would just point out to you that that last quote, or not the last line, but the last example, that is the statement, he then or she that shall marry for so base an end as profit without any possibility or prospect of love is guilty of the highest brutality imaginable, is exactly the quote that I showed before from the New Hampshire newspaper in 1796.
Before you leave.
One more question.
Professor,
Not
Professor
prepared
Norton.
for this one.
Based on your extensive research and learning in the course of this project, I'm wondering whether you might want to succeed Amy Dickinson on the national advice circuit.
She already has a successor whose name is Eric.
Doesn't sound right to me.
No, well,
So I'm sure the audience has a lot of questions, but I think I thought I might just ask a little bit more about this project. So we were only able to read a few snippets here. I think many of them were your favorites, but were there other ones that we couldn't include tonight that you thought were particularly notable?
well, there are some funny ones. Do you want me to talk? There's a very funny one about a guy who has red hair, and he's fallen for a woman who can't stand red hair. So he asks the Athenians to see if they can direct him to a place or someone who can dye his hair black or brown. And they actually say they recommend him shaving his head the way that John Dunton did, and keep his head shaved and wear a wig, and then his beloved will never know his hair was red. But what's funny is that sometimes on the second page of the Athenian Mercury, there's a little advertisement at the end, and usually they're advertisements for Dunton's own books. But in this particular case, there's an advertisement from a woman who says, I can do this. I can dye his hair. And it will stay fine. It will not be washed out. It will stay okay for 15 days at least, which is what he wanted.
Yeah. So this is letter writing into the Athenian. Is there any follow-up where it's a back and forth, several exchanges?
Hardly ever. I would love to have seen it. Sometimes there are people who write in and say they were stimulated to write by some letter they had read. But only once did I find a follow-up. Even though the Athenians sometimes say, let us know what happens, but you don't always, they don't, if they got letters from those people, you don't know. And I should say that although John Dunton has papers in Oxford at the Bodleian Library, and there are letters that are correspondence that relate to the Athenian Mercury, none of them are these letters. None of these originals survive. So there's a letter from a woman that they print, and she says it's a letter that is badly spelled, with bad grammar, and she basically says that she's in love with a man. She bore his child 3 years earlier. He's ghosting her, he's slighting her, and it's driving her crazy, and she's thinking of committing suicide because she's desperate. She cannot survive without him, and he's being so mean to her. So they respond. This is the one letter in the entire set of publications where the language is bad, where the spelling and the punctuation and everything is all off. And so they respond by saying, we can tell how low your character is by how terrible your grammar is and your spelling. And they basically say, you're a terrible person, and you have gotten yourself into this mess, and you need to repent and be penitent for your sins. Well, this was a very harsh answer, very unlike what they usually did. And a week later, literally a week later, with one issue in the middle, they run the same letter again, this time edited, and never indicating that they already answered it a week earlier. And this time, and so I rerun the letter, but very briefly, and this time they say, the guy's a jerk. And they do tell her, she's made a mistake, but they don't excoriate her language. They don't say you're a lowlife, which is what they said in the first answer. And they say the guy's a jerk, and they try to give her some advice about how to deal with this jerky guy. 2 weeks later, maybe it's 3 weeks, there's another letter. I am the unfortunate man. And he then reveals the whole story. He's in love with her. He wants to marry her. His parents say it will drive them to their graves if he marries her. And so they will not let him marry her. So basically he says, it's not my fault, it's my parents' fault. And basically they do something very unusual. Whereas they usually tell people they should be properly married, they say to this young couple, you are married to all intents and purposes. Ignore the parents, behave as though you're married, and let us know what happened. But if they did, I don't know. But anyway, they broke their usual rule of telling people either to obey your parents or get properly married.
Yeah. So I was preoccupied, so I didn't get to hear your opening comments.
You were taking
So I may ask you something you already covered.
Yeah, right.
But a lot of these had to do with relationships, but do they touch on any other topics?
Oh, sure. I mean, there are all kinds of other letters to the Athenians. I commented on that this is not the whole range of the questions. I mean, they get as many questions as they wanted on lots of questions on religion, lots of questions on science. So it's very eclectic. The publication itself is very eclectic. It's just I was interested in these. Yeah.
And have historians looked at this in a sustained way? What have people said or done with this?
Yeah, they have not. They have and they haven't. I mean, there's a biography of Dunton, which is quite good. It's called The Oracle of the Coffee House. Good title. There is a book which actually led me to the Athenian Mercury in the first place, by a woman named Helen Berry. She's the one who counted all the topics of the questions. It was published in the early aughts in Britain, and it's about gender and the Athenian Mercury. And I was interested in a previous book about gender definitions around 1700, so that's why I was interested in and looked at her book. So it's a very good scholarly examination of the issue of gender and the Athenian Mercury. But she does not do anything comprehensive either. I mean, there is nobody who's really sat down and said, okay, here's the total realm of questions that everybody's asking, and what might that mean? No, I mean, that would be a completely different book, and I wasn't interested in writing that one.
And so my last question, then we can open up to the audience, which is on that, this is a book that's very different from the other books you've written.
Yes, absolutely.
So what compelled you to write this book? And somebody that buys the book, which Mary Beth is also willing to stay and sign these books, and I encourage everybody to do so, what would you want somebody to take away from the book?
What I want people to take away is both the similarities and the differences with the kinds of problems people have today. Some of them are very standard questions in a lot of ways, although the details are different. Problems with in-laws, problems with parents, problems with, not so much with neighbors, and not so much with children, interestingly enough. These are young people who are writing these letters for the most part. Problems with courtship, problems with, I'm lonely, I want to meet somebody new. Those kinds of questions appear here. So there are things that stay the same, and there are things that are very different. And among the things that are very different are the inability of people to get divorced legally in the 17th century England. And so basically they work out all kinds of informal arrangements that they try to get the Athenians to say this is okay. And the Athenians, who are very moral and legally minded, say, no, they're not okay. You can't really do that. Even if you and your beloved have promised faithfully to be true to each other before God, if you're not actually married in a church, and if one of you's been married before, sorry, you can't do that. It just doesn't work. So there's that. The lack of divorce is actually very important, and they don't really have very good advice to give to abused spouses, especially to women. They do tell one guy who was a sailor. They basically tell him to, when his wife has committed adultery and flaunted it in front of him, and they basically tell him, just abandon her and go off, and she'll never know where you are. So in that case, they like the sailor. But they really don't have very good advice. There are women who write in and say they have their husbands beat them, their husbands have taken up with other women, their husbands are abandoning them and their children, and they basically have no good advice to give for them. So that's quite different from today. Another thing that's quite different from today is the whole issue of marriage, because there's no law in England defining what marriage is until 1753, which is 60 years after this. And so people sometimes don't know if they're married or who they're married to. And sometimes people are very matter of fact about the possibility of multiple marriages that overlap with each other. A woman wrote in and said, I was married, but I left my husband, and I married another man, and now the first husband, one of them has died. I forget which one now. One of them died, and now I want to marry a third one, but can I? What's the story? And then there's a guy who writes in very matter-of-factly and says, a man died to whom I owed money, and he had 2 wives. Which wife do I pay? So they're, it's a different world.
Great. I saw a question here and then also in the back.
So you mentioned that there were a couple of contributors to the column. Were all of the responses in the same voice, or was there one person responding, but there was a group advising session?
It's unclear. The contract that the three men had was that the two brothers-in-law would read the questions, would write the initial answers, and then John Dunton could change them any way he wanted to. So my assumption is that Dunton is the final voice. Although I wonder sometimes about the woman who was excoriated for her bad character, whether the minister didn't write that and that the others sort of said, no, that was too harsh, and so they took it back and they changed it. So, but it's impossible to know. They're supposed to be collaborative.
Mary Beth, do you have any evidence that...
I can't hear you. Yeah.
Do you have any evidence that these are real letters by real people?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question.
Because it seems to me it's a big prank, and I was thinking if Franklin had been born 50 years earlier, he would have thought this whole thing up and written all the questions and answers himself.
There were people at the time who said they're making it up. They wrote in and they said, you're making it up. And they basically said, we couldn't make this up. And some historians, too, have thought they made it up. But literally, there are thousands and thousands of letters. I mean, this publication lasted for 6 years, came out twice a week with up to 20 questions per issue. They were not making it up. I mean, the people who asked the questions might have been making it up. But of course, when they made it up, they were making it up in the context of their time. So I would argue that even if the specifics aren't, quote, real, the general context is, and the kinds of issues that are being discussed are. Here.
Thank you. Given the timeline, are there how many of the letters actually talk or questions talk about?
I'm sorry. What? How many?
How many? Do any of the questions touch on the colonies?
Very
whether
few.
To go, whether not to go. Or?
There are a couple of references to Maryland, to readers, to at least one reader in Maryland. But of course, since it took a long time for stuff to get back and forth across the Atlantic, who knows? But John Dunton had himself been in New England. And in the 1680s, he'd taken a load of books to sell in Boston. So he knew people in New England. And he was actually the publisher in London for Cotton and Increase Mather's works on witchcraft. And I actually first encountered him as that when I was working on my book on Salem witchcraft. I knew his name because I knew he had published their works in England. And so occasionally you'll see tidbits of news about New England. And sometimes I think these are fake letters. I think John Dunton wrote a letter that said, tell us the latest news from New England on the Indian War, and then answers it. I suspect that that's a plant by Dunton showing off his knowledge of what was going on in New England.
We have kind of a queue.
Yeah. We'll go Simon, then we'll go over there, and I think we've got some questions over here too. Yep.
Hi, looks wonderful, and I know that this collection is focused on love and marriage, but I'm curious also about if anyone's writing in about business difficulties or financial trouble or being defrauded by unscrupulous businessmen or anything like that, and if so, what kind of political slant that reflects in their answers.
I only looked for the ones on love and marriage. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of these, so I was as selective as I could be, the things I was focusing on. One does occasionally come across statements about fraud or issues of business in these letters. One that I especially remember is a man complaining that he married a woman who had been a sole trader in London. So she was a woman who had run her own business. And they were now having a problem. They were now having difficulties. And she was running off with some of his property. And could he stop her from doing that? So, and there are occasional, there's a fair amount of stuff about friction over money and so forth within the context of family. I'm sure there are letters about fraud. I just didn't look for them. You can look at the indexes if you can find them and see if you can find any. Yeah.
Thank you for an extremely entertaining evening. My question is, was John Duncan happily married? And is there any indication that either his wife or his brother-in-law's wives were involved in this effort?
Yeah, okay, so John Dunton's first marriage seems to have been quite happy. His wife was seems to have been a very good manager of his finances, and the fact that his finances fell completely apart after her death does indeed suggest that she was in charge of things for him. He does seem to have had a happy marriage originally. His brother-in-law, Samuel Wesley, had 17 children with his wife, 2 of whom were John and Charles Wesley, the founder of Methodism. Wow. So I haven't given you the names of the brothers-in-law, but actually Samuel Wesley's marriage was, though they had 17 children, it was famously fractious. So who knows? And the other brother-in-law, Richard Salt, before his death, admitted that he'd been involved in some philandering. So, there's no definite thing. But I will say this, one wonderful letter wrote in and said something like, the Athenians give us such wonderful advice, you must be great husbands. And the answer was, ask our wives.
Hi. First, I just want to say I feel like your alternate title could have been The Birth of Mansplaining. That's what I kept thinking about the whole time. But I'm curious to know, it seems like in the answers that we heard, they were all sort of what you would expect that would be in line with society or the church or sort of the standard mores. Were there ever sort of surprises to that? I mean, I would imagine these letter writers were looking for an alternative kind of take.
They may have been looking for an alternative, but as I said, the Athenians were really very moral. They're very committed to the standards of the Church of England, especially Wesley, obviously, because he is a clergyman. But in addition, their answers tend to be very moral. But sometimes they can be very sympathetic to the people who are writing in. And in addition, for example, they will say things like, to a woman who has committed adultery, they will say, you don't have to tell your husband, you only have to apologize to God. Be penitent before God, but you do not owe an apology to anyone on earth. So they do understand sort of normal foibles, shall we say. So they can be quite sympathetic. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, when I started this whole project, I was mostly interested in the questions, but the more I worked on it, the more interested I got in the answers. And for example, that last answer that Patrick read with that wonderful line about a man who marries a woman he cannot love will love a woman he cannot marry, or will love a woman he cannot marry. So there are some very witty things. There's some very dry humor sort of embedded in some of the answers. For example, there's a woman who writes in and says she doesn't know how she became pregnant. There must have been in her sleep, and something mysterious must have happened. And they say, don't worry about that. You do not need to worry. We know the answer. And she wants to know how to get rid of the baby. And they tell her, do not try abortion. Well, we don't know how far along she was or anything, but they tell her, don't try abortion. By the way, they're not in favor of abortion. They're not in favor of any artificial contraception. Although they do say husband and wife, if they want to avoid births, can avoid having sex. They do say that, as long as both men and women agree. But, wait a minute, I got distracted from point I was making about the, let's see.
You're talking about abortion.
Yeah, about abortion. Oh, yes. What to do? What should that young woman do who was pregnant and didn't want to be? Basically, they said, find a nice companion, take a long journey, and then come back after you've had the child somewhere else, in brackets.
Last question.
Oh, I just wanted Mary Beth to comment. A gentleman over there asked about references to the colonies. There was one letter that...
I'm sorry, Carol, I can't hear.
Oh, okay. Is this better?
Yeah.
There was a gentleman over there who asked for references about the colonies. There was one letter you and I talked about where the questioner wrote in, I can't find a wife in England. What should I do? And the answer was, go look in the colonies.
Yeah, right, yes, right. She's read the book. Well,
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mary Beth. I also want to take a moment to remind everybody that Mary Beth's book is available for sale in the back. But I also want to take a moment for all of us to thank Jessica Frankenfield.
Yes.
Jess has been the communications and program officer at the Society for almost a decade. And she is leaving us soon to be the associate director at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. We will miss her, but she has served so well and ably for almost 10 years and has run this program that you all have been able to enjoy. So I think we all owe Jess a round of applause.
Oh, she's leaving.
All right. Thank you all. See you on June the 5th.